Welcome, dear listeners. Thank you for joining us today as we quietly explore the world of history in a slow and soothing way. In this video, we will drift gently into the experience of soldiers during the First World War, discovering how people slept in the trenches, mud by mud. And while the story may seem slow or uneventful, it is precisely this calm, steady exploration that allows us to reflect, to imagine, and perhaps even to drift into your own restful state as we move together through these hours of history. And if you enjoy this kind of slow, meditative journey through the past, we invite you to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts with us in the comments, telling us where you are listening from and what time it is there, as it is always fascinating to see how our quiet history travels across the world. And so, settle in, make yourself comfortable, and let us begin this gentle passage into the lives of those who lived, endured, and rested in ways so different from our own. When one imagines the trenches of the First World War, the mind often leaps to noise, to the rolling thunder of artillery and the crack of rifles echoing across the battered landscape, to the rush of soldiers going over the top, to the moments of chaos that defined the memory of that war. Yet the truth is that much of trench life was not spent in the din of combat, but in the long, slow hours in between, hours where men waited, endured, and tried to hold on to the simplest parts of human existence. And among these, the most elusive, and yet the most necessary, was sleep. For as the sun lowered behind the horizon and the ruined fields grew dim, soldiers were not retreating to barracks or to warm cottages, but to narrow ditches lined with mud, where water pooled and rats darted, where straw was sodden and air was damp, and where every attempt to close one's eyes became a small battle against discomfort, against cold, against the fears of what might happen before dawn. To imagine it clearly, one must picture the landscape at twilight, a ground chewed up by shellfire, stripped of trees, with wire twisted across the fields, with puddles glistening faintly in the fading light, the sky not soft and peaceful, but heavy and restless, always carrying with it the low growl of distant guns. And in that environment, men settled into their positions for the night, some slumping wearily against the side of the trench, rifles always within arm's reach, some crouching in dugouts carved into the earthen wall, their ceilings dripping with condensation, others stretching themselves out on makeshift bedding, no more comfortable than damp straw or a ground sheet if they were fortunate, and all of them bound together by the same weight of exhaustion. For sleep in the trenches was not a luxury nor a gentle drifting, but a surrender, a giving in to weariness so deep that the body would collapse into rest wherever and however it could, even while the mind remained half alert to the reality of danger. For in such places, sleep was never entirely safe and never entirely restful, but always absolutely necessary. The air itself seemed to press in at night, heavy with dampness, for trenches were dug in low ground, places where water collected, and the soil was rarely dry. So the walls glistened with moisture, and the floor was a sucking mud that clung to boots and seeped into clothing. And when men lay down, they did so upon that mud, often without barrier, their greatcoats wrapped tightly for warmth and serving as both blanket and pillow, their packs sometimes pressed beneath their heads in an effort to raise them slightly above the wet ground, though never enough to be truly dry. And the smell of the trench was a mixture of soil, smoke, sweat, and stagnant water, smell that seemed stronger in the stillness of night when the distractions of daylight faded. And yet, to those who lived within it, this was simply the constant background of existence, endured as naturally as the rhythm of breathing. And so they closed their eyes beneath low earthen ceilings or beneath the open sky. They listened to the soft dripping of water from the roof of a dugout or the faint shuffle of boots along the trench, and they tried, however briefly, to allow themselves to forget that they were in the middle of a war. Though forgetting was rarely possible, for even in sleep, their bodies never fully released the tension. Their rest was shallow, fragile, and easily broken by the sound of a rifle crack, the whisper of a rat, or the barked command of an officer. Fatigue was constant, unrelenting, for soldiers were not simply fighters, but laborers, tasked with carrying supplies, digging new lines, repairing collapsed walls, and standing endless watches. And so, their nights were fragmented, with some permitted to rest while others remained on guard, and then the roles reversed. And even in the short spans of time allotted for sleep, there was no certainty that they would not be woken suddenly, either by orders or by the natural unease of their own minds, for though their bodies begged for rest, their thoughts often lingered on the possibility of attack or the simple dread of another long day of waiting. And so dreams, when they arrived, were faint and fleeting, fragile constructions broken by the smallest interruption, leaving men to wake as tired as they had been when they closed their eyes. And the trench itself was never truly silent, always filled with subtle noises, the creak of wood, supports under strain, the shifting of a comrade turning in his sleep, the constant dripping of water, and beyond these, the background hum of war itself, distant but ever present, reminding the men, even in their most private moments, that the line of battle was still alive. And in such an atmosphere, sleep was not an escape, but a pause, a shallow pocket of rest carved out of endless weariness. The routines of settling down were stripped of comfort and ritual, for there were no beds to prepare, no sheets, no fires to warm the air, but only the simplest actions, a helmet removed and placed within reach, boots loosened but never taken off completely, for there was no telling when the need to rise quickly might come, coats wrapped tightly across the chest, and heads laid upon packs or against the side of the trench wall, sometimes with 2 or 3 men huddled together to share warmth, for the chill was biting, and though closeness was not always comfortable, it was better than freezing alone, and in such companionship there was at least the reminder that they were not entirely isolated, that others breathed the same damp air and endured the same discomfort, and that knowledge softened the edges of misery. For many, the first night spent in the trenches was the most difficult, for the shock of finding oneself in such a world, where the ground was unsteady, where the walls seemed to close in, and where the air itself felt alive with dampness, was overwhelming, and attempts to rest seemed impossible. But as days passed into weeks, the body adapted, not because the conditions improved, but because the need for sleep was greater than any resistance. And exhaustion taught men to rest in snatched fragments, falling asleep, sitting upright against the wall, or with heads rested on their knees. And these moments of unconsciousness, though brief, became enough to sustain them. And in those fragile sleeps, men still dreamed, though their dreams were not always peaceful, yet often they were simple dreams of home, of quiet meals, of warm beds left behind. And though such dreams might vanish with the waking, they brought comfort for the brief time they lingered, a fragile bridge between the harsh present and the gentler past. And so, trench sleep was never only physical, but emotional, carrying with it the ache of memory and the longing for what was absent. Thus, as the sun faded and night descended across the front, the men, heavy with fatigue, let their bodies collapse into what rest they could find, pressing themselves into mud, into damp straw, into shallow dugouts, closing their eyes against discomfort, against fear, against the endless sounds of war, and in that act, repeated night after night, the reality of trench sleep revealed itself not as peace, not as restoration, but as survival, a nightly endurance measured mud by mud, breath by breath, until the pale light of dawn rose again to call them back to another day of waiting in the trenches. When one considers the matter of how soldiers attempted to sleep in the trenches of the First World War, it is almost impossible to separate that effort from the omnipresent presence of moisture. For the trenches themselves were not simply dug earthworks, but narrow corridors of sodden mud that seemed to collect and hold every drop of rain, every seepage from the nearby fields, every bit of condensation that gathered in the heavy night air. And so, when the men tried to rest, they did not simply lie down upon solid ground, but instead lowered themselves into an environment that pressed dampness into their uniforms, their boots, their blankets, and into their very bones. And this dampness was not the refreshing coolness of a summer rain, but the clinging, persistent wetness that never dried and never lifted, so that the soldiers found themselves perpetually surrounded by the smell of wet wool, the feel of sodden cloth clinging to their skin, and the squelch of mud whenever they shifted even slightly in their attempts to make themselves comfortable. And because the trenches were so narrow and so low, there was no place to escape from this wetness, no corner of dryness where a man might spread his blanket and find a small measure of relief. For even the duckboards that had been laid along the trench floor to keep men above the mud quickly became waterlogged, slick, and soft under pressure, and they could not stop the seepage that rose from below. So when a soldier closed his eyes in the hope of sleep, he did so with the knowledge that his uniform would still be damp when he awoke, his socks still cold against his skin, and his blanket still heavy with water. And this constant exposure brought with it a slow, creeping exhaustion, not only because it was uncomfortable, but because it weakened the body in subtle ways, chilling the muscles, stiffening the joints, and bringing the risk of trench foot, a condition that haunted soldiers with its threat of numbness, blisters, and infection, so that even the simple act of resting carried the worry of what damage might be quietly occurring to their feet as they lay in the mud. And this awareness made it difficult to find ease, for how can the body release itself into the calmness of sleep when the mind is persistently aware of the ache in the toes, the rub of wet cloth against the heel, and the knowledge that one's boots will not dry by morning, but instead remain as waterlogged as the trench itself? And so the men learned, slowly and without choice, to close their eyes while damp, to sleep curled within their blankets, even though those blankets held as much water as they did warmth, to tuck their feet beneath themselves or against the side of the trench wall in the hope of lessening the pressure from the mud. And though such strategies brought only marginal relief, they became part of the nightly ritual, a weary acceptance that comfort was no longer a matter of luxury, but of degrees of dampness, where slightly less wet might feel like a gift, and slightly warmer patches of mud might be remembered as small mercies. And within this slow process of acclimatization, the soldiers discovered that the body could, in time, learn to rest even when it was not truly comfortable, that the human frame, when pushed to its limits, can close its eyes in the middle of wetness, mud, and chill, not because it has been offered ease, but because exhaustion leaves no alternative. And thus the men surrendered to this damp sleep, night after night, lying in their trenches with the rain still falling softly overhead, with a drip of condensation from the trench walls, with the sound of water collecting in shallow pools around their boots, and with the low hum of fatigue that pressed them downward into a heavy, dreamless rest, as if the mud itself had claimed them for its own. And in that slow surrender, they became not so much sleepers as figures waiting to be absorbed into the trench, bodies that learned to rest not above the earth, but within it, wrapped in a cocoon of dampness that would never truly release them. And in this way, the act of sleeping in the trenches was less about restoration and more about resignation, a slow acknowledgement that mud, like fatigue, was unrelenting, and that to survive meant to lie down in it again and again until it became as much a part of the soldier as his uniform, his boots, or his blanket, a condition of existence that could not be altered, only endured, night by night, mud by mud. When we think about the night falling over the battlefields of the First World War, we often imagine silence, a kind of restful pause after the chaos of the day. But for the men who lived in the trenches, night was not a time of peace, but a slow and heavy burden. A stretch of hours when the body longed for sleep, and yet the mind and the environment resisted it at every turn. And in this way, the darkness carried its own weight, a kind of pressing stillness broken only by the drip of water seeping into dugouts, the rustle of rats scurrying over boots, or the distant low thunder of artillery rumbling like a storm that never seemed to pass. And so the soldier would try to rest where he could, often crouched or lying in a damp corner, his greatcoat pulled tight over his shoulders, his head resting not on a pillow but perhaps on his pack, his helmet, or simply his arm folded awkwardly against a wall of earth beside him. And though exhaustion pulled at him, true sleep was rare. It came not as a gentle drifting, but as a sudden lapse, a slipping away for a few minutes or perhaps an hour, punctuated by jerks, awake at the sound of a whistle, a shouted order, or the slap of boots passing along the duckboards. And this pattern of half waking and half sleeping became the rhythm of trench life at night, a rhythm that never allowed for the deep rest the body craved, but instead left men suspended in a kind of drowsy limbo, neither fully awake nor entirely asleep. It is worth pausing to picture what the trench looked like under the dim light of night, because it was not the quiet, moonlit trench of films, but often a place drenched in shadows, broken only by the pale flare of star shells arcing overhead, casting for a moment the entire battlefield into stark black and white before plunging it once again into darkness. And each flare reminded the men that eyes were always watching, that even the act of closing one's own eyes was a risk, because somewhere out there, not so far away, an enemy soldier might be peering across no man's land, his rifle resting silently on the parapet, waiting for the faintest sign of movement. This constant awareness turned the night into something oppressive. And sleep, when it came, was always under strain, a fragile thread that could snap at the slightest sound, so that men woke sweating even when there was no real danger, startled by a clump of mud falling from the trench wall, or the creak of wood shifting in the damp. And then there was the cold, for even in seasons when the days were mild, the nights in the open trench grew bitterly chilly. The wet earth exhaling its damp breath, the water pooling at the bottom of the trench, sucking away warmth from boots and blankets, and the men would wrap themselves as tightly as they could in coats and scarves, their breath forming pale clouds in the darkness. Yet still, the chills seeped into bones and joints, and many wrote in diaries that their sleep was more a shivering doze than a proper rest, waking with aching limbs and stiff fingers that never quite warmed until daylight returned. Imagine, too, the smell that clung to the trench at night, stronger when the air was still, the mixture of damp soil, mildew from rotting wooden supports, smoke from earlier shell fire lingering in the air, and always the underlying odor of unwashed bodies pressed close together, for the men could not bathe. And their uniforms carried the sour temps of sweat mixed with the sharpness of mud and clay. And it is easy to see how sleep came uneasily in such surroundings, with the senses constantly irritated, never soothed, as though every aspect of the trench conspired against rest. Yet, despite all of this, men adapted, for the human body has a strange ability to snatch fragments of sleep, even where none seems possible. And so, soldiers dozed with their rifles propped beside them, or curled in dugouts barely wide enough to lie flat, their boots still on, because there was no telling when they might be called out to stand to arms. And sometimes, in rare moments of quiet, a soldier might sink into a deeper slumber, only to wake disoriented, unsure whether he had been asleep for 10 minutes or 2 hours, and in that moment of groggy confusion, he might almost forget where he was, till the damp chill and the smell reminded him, pulling him back into the reality of trench life. Diaries from the time often describe this pattern in unembellished terms. One man noted that he slept in snatches, like a dog by the fire, never for long, never at peace, and another wrote that he envied the dead, for they, at least, had rest, and such words captured the exhaustion that was not just physical, but also mental, for the strain of always being half awake wears on the mind as much as on the body. In thinking about this, one sees how the night in the trenches was not truly a time of sleep, but a different kind of battle. It's quieter, but no less demanding, a battle against fatigue, cold, fear, and discomfort. And in this sense, each night was endured rather than passed through peacefully. There was, too, the strange companionship of shared suffering. Because though each man lay in his own little space, the trench was crowded, and one soldier could hear the breathing of another, the low cough, the shifting of blankets, the whispered words exchanged in the darkness, and this presence gave a kind of comfort. A reminder that no one was enduring the weight of the night entirely alone, even if that presence also meant more noise, more movement, and thus more interruptions too, the fragile hope of sleep. And so the night in the trenches stretched out, long and uneven, a pattern of dozing and waking, cold seeping in, and of moments of strange half-dreams broken by reality. And when the first pale light of dawn crept into the sky, the men stirred, with a weary relief, not because the new day promised rest, for it rarely did, but because the heaviness of the night had finally lifted, and they could rise, stretch aching limbs, and face the day with at least the comfort that the long hours of darkness had once again been survived, mud by mud, moment by moment, without surrendering entirely to despair. When the sun at last dipped below the jagged silhouette of the torn landscape, the world of the trenches shifted into another rhythm, one not defined by the day's labor of carrying supplies, digging, and maintaining defenses, but by the quiet struggle to carve out rest in conditions that resisted it at every turn. For nightfall in the trenches did not bring the softness or the peace one might expect from a world without daylight, but rather it introduced a new set of challenges that made the simple act of sleeping both a rare luxury and a physical trial that tested endurance as much as battle itself. And for the men who lived in this liminal space between life and death, between waiting and action, sleep was never something one simply decided to do. It was something that came when the body had no strength left to resist, something clawed out of moments of exhaustion and layered on top of mud, noise, and fear, as if rest itself was part of the war they were fighting. And the falling darkness was only a reminder that tomorrow would bring more of the same. In those hours, just after night fell, the first instinct of many was not to sleep, but rather to secure their gear, to adjust their coats, to check their rifles, to make sure they were as prepared for the night as they had been for the day, because night carried its own dangers, raids, shelling, flares, and the eerie stillness that could break into sudden violence without warning, and because of this constant uncertainty, the body learned to live in a state of tension, a state where muscles never fully relaxed and ears were always attuned to every sound. And in such a state, sleep was not rest, but more like drifting into a shallow half-consciousness, one eye closed, while the other waited for the call to stand, to man the line, or to brace for the shock of artillery. Yet, even as these fears lingered, the men needed sleep, and they knew it, for their strength and sanity depended upon at least a few hours of rest. And so, once the work of evening was done, whether that was reinforcing sandbags, checking the duckboards, or moving supplies along the trench lines, they began the process of finding space where they might lie down. Though the word lie down was often too generous for what actually occurred, for more often than not, the men simply found a place to slump against the trench wall, knees tucked in, coat pulled tight, helmet resting loosely, the ground beneath them still damp and sticky with the day's rains. Else they wedged themselves into dugouts, which, while offering a measure of cover from the weather and the occasional shell fragment, were often so cramped, crowded, and filled with the stale smell of sweat and damp earth that they resembled little more than hollow caverns where bodies pressed close, heads tilted at awkward angles, and where the snores and groans of comrades blended with the faint scratching of rats along the walls. In such spaces, falling asleep was not a graceful act, but a kind of collapse, as though the body, too weary to resist, simply folded inward and gave way, even if the ground was hard, even if water pooled beneath one's boots, even if lice crawled along the seams of one's shirt, for exhaustion was its own weight, dragging the soldier downward into slumber despite the world's discomforts. And yet, even in sleep, the mind rarely found peace. For the constant rumble of artillery in the distance was never absent. The sounds of shells echoing like far-off thunder, sometimes growing nearer, sometimes fading, but always reminding the sleeper that danger lived just beyond the horizon. In those moments of rest, the boundary between wakefulness and dream blurred, so that soldiers often dreamed of the very sounds they had just heard, dreamed of shells that fell endlessly, dreamed of mud that swallowed them whole, dreamed of waking only to find themselves still trapped in the same trench, as though the line between reality and the dream world had dissolved in the endless repetition of discomfort and fatigue. The night brought with it darkness, but it was rarely a true darkness, for the battlefield was alive with sudden bursts of light flares fired into the air that bathed the trenches in ghostly brightness, shadows shifting like phantoms across the walls, with the dull glow of burning wreckage out on no man's land. Each flare would jolt the half-sleeping men into awareness, faces illuminated for a moment, breath caught, waiting to see if the flare marked the beginning of some movement, some raid, or some call to arms. And only when the light faded could they try once again to slip into uneasy rest. For those assigned to watch duty, there was no such chance. Instead, they stood at their posts through the cold night air, eyes straining into the darkness, ears listening for the faintest sound, and when their turn ended, they would step down, numb from the chill, body aching, and only then might they allow themselves to sink into a corner of the trench, shivering beneath their coat as they sought warmth in the shared presence of their fellows. It was in these quiet intervals that camaraderie itself played a role in sleep, for the comfort of bodies pressed together in dugouts, of shared blankets, and of whispered conversation before drifting off, created a fragile sense of human connection that allowed men to feel less alone in the darkness. And though the sleep itself remained shallow, though it was broken by coughing, by the scuttling of rats, by a sudden noise from the front, it was still something, still a lifeline that carried them into the next day. And as the hours passed and night crept onward, there came a rhythm to this half-rest, a kind of routine shaped not by comfort but by endurance. Then the soldiers learned, slowly and reluctantly, to take what they could, to close their eyes even, if only for a quarter of an hour, to allow their muscles to slacken for a brief time before the next interruption. And this rhythm became the measure of survival, for without it, the body faltered, the mind wandered, and the strength to carry on through another day of trench life was lost. In this way, nightfall did not mark an end to struggle, but merely shifted it, turning the labor of digging and carrying into the labor of trying to rest, the labor of folding one's body into mud and shadow and calling it sleep. And while the world outside the trenches might imagine night as a time of relief, for the soldiers it was merely another battlefield, one fought not with rifles or shells, but with heavy eyelids, aching limbs, and the endless effort to carve a moment of peace in a place designed to give none. It is difficult to overstate the power mud held over the lives of soldiers in the trenches of the First World War. Grit, and perhaps no single element shaped the way they slept or attempted to sleep, more than this thick, clinging, relentless substance that seemed to seep into every corner of existence. Mud was not simply an inconvenience, nor was it a temporary irritation that could be brushed aside at will. It was, instead, a defining feature of trench life. A constant reminder of the earth's weight pressing down upon men who already bore the weight of war itself, and to understand how soldiers slept in those sodden dugouts and open firing lines, one must first understand how mud altered their bodies, their spirits, and the very ground beneath their feet, because the trenches were carved into low-lying fields, often waterlogged farmland churned endlessly by artillery shells. And when rain fell, which it did with merciless regularity, water pooled quickly, refusing to drain away, turning floors into bogs and walls into slick, crumbling hazards, so that a soldier lying down to sleep did not simply rest upon damp earth, but instead upon an ever-shifting soup of clay, soil, and stagnant water that could swallow boots, blankets, and in tragic cases, even men themselves. For more than one soldier was known to drown in the mire when exhaustion made him careless. Thus, when a man tried to close his eyes, the very act of finding a patch of relatively dry ground became an ordeal. And if he was fortunate enough to have duckboards beneath him, those rough wooden planks offered some reprieve, though even they grew slick and unstable, often floating like rafts in the trenches as the water rose, creaking beneath the weight of weary bodies who sought rest upon their narrow surfaces. And yet, despite the misery mud caused, it was impossible to escape, impossible to scrub away entirely, for it clung to uniforms, caked on rifles, filled in the grooves of boots, and crept into bedding, so that even when a man lay down, he carried with him the muck of the trenches, his blanket heavy with wet, his body chilled to the bone by the dampness that never fully left. The sensation of mud was more than physical. It became psychological, because to sleep in the trenches meant to submit to it, to lie down knowing that it would seep into one's clothes and skin, that the morning would bring not relief but another layer of dirt and damp, and this knowledge made rest uneasy, sallow, and fragile. For how can the body truly surrender to slumber when it lies half submerged in the cold embrace of the earth itself? When each movement brings the squelch of sodden ground, and when each breath is filled with the rank smell of rot rising from the wet soil. Letters home often spoke of the endless mud, sometimes with dark humor, sometimes with despair. And one can picture a soldier riding by candlelight, trying to explain to his family that his bed was not a bed at all, but rather a patch of sludge, where rats scurried freely, where lice thrived, and where every attempt at comfort was undone by the simple reality of rain and soil conspiring against him. So even the act of lying down became an act of resignation, and men learned to fall asleep in odd positions, perched on the edge of parapets, leaning against trench walls, or huddled together on sandbags in hopes of finding some angle where the ground beneath would not consume them. The mud dictated posture, dictated routine, dictated the very rhythm of rest. And when one imagines an army at war, the mind may leap to battles and charges, but here in the trenches, the greater battle was often with the very land itself. And nowhere was this more evident than in the endless fight against the mud. Officers ordered trenches drained, men dug sumps, pumps were installed, but nothing could keep the water fully at bay, and so the cycle continued, day after day, with soldiers scraping muck from their boots, only to see it return within minutes, laying down to sleep, knowing they would wake with their greatcoats stiff and heavy, their bodies aching from the cold, wet ground, and the toll this took was not just physical, but deeply emotional. 4 men wrote of feeling as though the mud was swallowing their very souls, pulling them down, erasing their sense of being clean, dry, or human, reducing them instead to creatures of the trenches, half buried, half forgotten, existing between earth and sky with no reprieve. And yet, despite all this, sleep did come, for the body, driven beyond exhaustion, will always find a way, but the quality of that sleep was poor haunted, shallow, okay, and often interrupted by dreams shaped not only by the thunder of shells, but by the suffocating embrace of the mud itself. Dreams of sinking, of drowning, of being unable to move, which reflected the waking reality of life lived knee-deep in filth. So that sleep became not escape, but a continuation of suffering in another form. And perhaps the most striking thing to consider is that this was not a temporary hardship endured for days or weeks, but for months, even years, and men rotated back to the rear, only to return again, to face once more the trenches and their endless mire. And so mud became both the physical bed in which they lay and the symbol of trench warfare itself, for it was always there, waiting, shaping every attempt at rest, every moment when a soldier closed his eyes and tried, against all odds, to drift into the fragile refuge of sleep. The trenches of the First World War were not only defined by the mud, peas, the stench, and the ever-present threat of shells and snipers, but also by a ceaseless soundtrack of noise that made the very idea of restful sleep feel like an unattainable dream. For noise in the trenches was not an occasional intrusion. It was a constant reality that wrapped itself around every soldier, day and night, without relief. And it is in this unending cacophony that we begin to understand how sleep became not only a physical need, but also a rare and fragile victory against the conditions of war. Because, while one might imagine that nightfall brought with it some measure of calm, the truth was that darkness often intensified the din, as armies used the cover of night to move supplies, launch raids, or fire harassing artillery, leaving soldiers in the trenches with no predictable rhythm of peace and quiet. Instead, forced to live in a world where every sound carried potential danger, and where the body and mind, desperate for rest, had to adapt to drifting into uneasy slumber surrounded by thunderous reminders of mortality. So when we imagine soldiers trying to sleep, it is important not to envision a lullaby of silence, but rather a forced surrender to exhaustion, while explosions, gunfire, and human voices never ceased around them. The most dominant layer of this soundscape was artillery, the great booming guns that could be heard miles behind the front lines, their shells screaming through the air with terrifying velocity before crashing into the earth with an impact that shook the ground and rattled the dugouts, sometimes nearby, sometimes in the distance, but always present, and even when the shells did not fall close. Their sound carried with such resonance that men spoke of being able to feel the vibrations through their chests and bones, as though the very earth had become a drum upon which war pounded its relentless rhythm. And this pounding did not stop when soldiers tried to sleep. For even in moments when the front was considered quiet, there were always sporadic shell bursts meant to keep the enemy unsettled, and this policy of harassment ensured that no soldier could ever truly relax, because a single shell could arrive without warning, turning an attempt at slumber into a fatal mistake, which meant that even in the rare hours of supposed calm, the mind of the soldier remained alert, listening for changes in tone, for the whistling approach that might mean danger was imminent. And so sleep, when it came, was often light, broken, and filled with dreams that blurred into waking fears. Yet artillery was only one element of the trench orchestra, for layered upon its thunder was the rattle of machine guns, which often chattered in long bursts through the night, sometimes in real combat, sometimes in suppression fire meant merely to keep heads down. And the sound of these weapons became so familiar that soldiers described it as almost mechanical in its rhythm, a grinding reminder that death could be delivered at any moment. And while the crack of rifles joined in too, these were sharper, quicker sounds that punctuated the nights with unpredictable stabs of noise. And behind all this weaponry, there were the sounds of human activity. Men coughing in the damp cold, officers shouting orders, comrades shifting in their dugouts, and the groans of the wounded echoing out into the darkness Every one of these human noises a reminder that they were not alone, that they were part of a body of men trapped together in conditions that gave no space for solitude or silence, and, yet, paradoxically, left each man alone in his exhaustion, battling his own body's desperate need for rest against a backdrop of unending sound. The difficulty of sleeping under such conditions was not merely physical, but psychological, for the nervous system of the soldier was under constant strain, always braced for the next sound to signal imminent death, and this led to what we now might describe as a form of hypervigilance, where even the suggestion of quiet became stressful, because silence itself was deceptive, sign that something, an attack, a raid, or a gas release might be imminent. And so there was never an escape from the tension, never a chance to close one's eyes without fear, which meant that many soldiers drifted not into true sleep, but into a restless doze, half-aware state where the body shut down from sheer fatigue, but the mind never truly released its grip on awareness. A survival mechanism, perhaps, but one that robbed men of the kind of rest the human body requires to heal and recover. And over time, this deprivation compounded, leaving men irritable, exhausted, and sometimes near the edge of mental collapse. There are countless testimonies of soldiers describing how the noise of war continued to haunt them, even after they were rotated away from the front. How in billets behind the lines, in hospitals, or even after returning home, the echo of artillery continued in their minds, a kind of auditory memory that could not be silenced. And many wrote of how the sound of a car backfiring, thunder in the sky, or even the banging of a door would bring them instantly back to the trenches, heart racing, body tense, as though they were once again trying to sleep under bombardment. And this persistence of noise in the mind speaks to the deep impact it had on the soldier's sense of rest. Sleep became not only scarce in the trenches, but also elusive afterward, stolen by memories that played on an endless loop long after the guns had fallen silent. Yet amid this environment, soldiers did manage to find ways of coping, if not of eliminating the noise, then of learning to sleep through it. For the body, when pushed beyond its limits, will take what it needs, and so men spoke of collapsing into slumber, even as shells burst nearby, of dozing on fire steps with rifles in hand, of falling asleep while standing guard. Their exhaustion so overwhelming that it conquered even the thunder of war, though such sleep was rarely restorative, and always carried risk, for the noise might mask a more immediate danger, and being too deeply asleep could mean being caught unaware. Yet still the body claimed those moments, 'cause without them survival itself would have been impossible. And in this lies one of the more haunting truths of trench life, that soldiers did not truly sleep so much as they succumbed to exhaustion. Their rest wrestled from war rather than freely given by it. And this forced, fragile slumber, always incomplete and always under siege, shaped their lives at the front as much as mud, hunger, or cold. Thus, when we reflect on how soldiers of the Great War slept, we must remember that they did so not in silence, but against a backdrop of relentless sound, and that this noise was not just an external condition, but an internal burden that followed them into their dreams, into their memories, and into their futures. And it is here, in the trenches, where noise itself became a weapon, that we see how rest was transformed from a simple human necessity into a battle fought nightly, one that many won only temporarily, and one whose scars they carried long after the guns themselves fell silent. In the trenches of the First World War, sleep was never a gentle descent into silence, but instead a precarious surrender to exhaustion. And nowhere was this more apparent than under the constant threat of shellfire, which made the very act of closing one's eyes a gamble against sudden and violent death. For when men tried to rest their weary bodies after long hours of sentry duty or back-breaking labor, the booming roar of artillery could erupt without warning, shattering both nerves and slumber. And it is difficult to overstate just how profoundly this constant bombardment shaped the way soldiers experienced sleep. Because deep, restorative rest, the kind in which the body repairs itself and the mind processes its burdens, was rendered nearly impossible when each moment carried the possibility of an incoming shell. And so men adapted in ways that were less about true sleep and more about grabbing fragments of unconsciousness between bursts of thunder. Like a drowning man gasping for air between waves, never knowing when the next one would crash down. For, in the trenches, sound itself was a weapon, the ground trembling beneath the shock waves of distant and not so distant explosions. The air filled with vibrations that rattled dugouts and seeped into men's bones. And even when a shell did not land close enough to maim or kill, its detonation was enough to startle, to awaken, to set hearts racing in terror. So that soldiers often found themselves jolting awake with pounding hearts, sweating in the dark, uncertain if the next shell would be the one that reached them, which meant their nights were not nights in the ordinary sense, but rather fragmented stretches of half-sleep punctuated by jolts of adrenaline. And this unnatural rhythm of restlessness wore away at their bodies as surely as hunger or cold, leaving them gaunt and hollow-eyed, sometimes even muttering incoherently as fatigue eroded their minds, because a brain that never rests fully begins to betray its owner, producing confusion, poor memory, and strange waking dreams. And though the men may have longed desperately for the heavy, dreamless sleep of home, they were instead trapped in this limbo, dozing lightly in shifts, never truly safe, never truly still, their ears straining for the whine of approaching shells. And for those who were especially unlucky, cacophony of an active bombardment, when artillery rained down relentlessly for hours or even days at a time, an inferno of sound so great that conversation became impossible and even shouting required lung-bursting effort. So that when such barrages finally ceased, soldiers found themselves almost deafened by the ringing in their ears, staggering around, in silence that felt alien after such thunder, but sleep in such moments remained elusive. For the nervous system, once wound so tightly, could not simply be unwound. And even in the rare pauses between shelling, men's minds often conjured phantom explosions, the echoes reverberating inside their skulls as if the earth still trembled. And so their sleep was haunted, not only by the real threat of death from above, but by the imagined continuation of its terrors, which returned in dreams as nightmares, where men relived the fire and fury they had just survived. And it is worth pausing to imagine how this would feel. For most of us associate sleep with relief and comfort, but in the trenches it was the very opposite. For to drift off meant leaving oneself vulnerable in a place where sudden death came at random, where no warning could prepare a man, and where even the dugouts, those crude shelters dug into the earth and reinforced with wood or sandbags, afforded little true safety. For a direct hit could collapse them in an instant, burying their occupants alive, which meant that the very spaces meant to provide rest also carried their own terrors. And men entered them with the uneasy awareness that they might not emerge, while those who tried to sleep above ground in shallow trenches or dugouts risked exposure to shrapnel, stray bullets, or the deadly fragments of shells that sprayed like scythes across the earth, making every position a compromise, every rest uneasy. And so soldiers learned to live in a perpetual state of half-wakefulness, their bodies adapting to survive on mere fragments of sleep, sometimes just a few minutes snatched in the lulls between, shelling, leaning against a wall of mud, or lying in water-soaked straw. And they would awaken at the slightest sound, their senses tuned to the frequency of danger, and while some grew hardened, others broke down entirely, for not all human minds can withstand such relentless strain, and thus shellfire was not only a physical weapon, but a psychological one, deliberately used to exhaust and demoralize the enemy. A constant reminder of vulnerability. And if one asks how men endured such conditions for weeks or months on end, the answer is that many did not, for some were carried away by stretcher bearers, broken not by wounds of the body, but by wounds of the mind. What was then called shell shock, when sleep and waking became indistinguishable, when nerves twitched uncontrollably, when speech faltered, when men froze like statues, unresponsive to command, for their inner strength had been eroded by nights without peace, days without true rest, until the body simply refused to continue. And yet, even for those who did endure, survival came at a cost, for the deprivation of deep sleep robbed them of the resilience needed to face each new dawn, leaving them increasingly brittle. And still, orders were orders, and the war demanded endurance. So men returned to their posts and carried on, leaning on each other, sharing what little comfort they could. Sometimes even finding ways to laugh in the intervals between bombardments, though the laughter itself was tinged with weariness, the sort that comes from knowing tomorrow will be no easier. And always behind it lay the memory of the shells, the terrible thunder that robbed them of rest. For in the trenches of the First World War, shellfire was not merely an external hazard, it was an intimate companion, invading every dream, haunting every moment of respite, ensuring that deep, healing sleep, the kind that sustains life, remained an impossibility. Sleep in the trenches of the First World War was never simply about closing one's eyes and drifting away into rest, 'cause in those waterlogged dugouts and narrow ditches carved into the scarred earth of France and Belgium, the very air seemed to resist calm, and one of the most unyielding enemies to rest was not hunger or cold or lice, but the unending and unpredictable chorus of artillery fire that rattled the ground, shook the timbers overhead, and echoed within every soldier's bones. The guns were ceaseless, sometimes a steady rhythm of shells fired in measured bursts, sometimes sudden explosions in the distance, and other times the violent and immediate whistle of incoming fire that could mean death within seconds. And the psychological burden of that sound, that relentless drumming, was enough to deprive men of rest, even in the rare moments when the front itself seemed momentarily quiet, because the human mind, so tightly wound by fear, could not untangle itself from the anticipation of the next blast. And so, a soldier lying on the damp floor of a trench might try to pull a greatcoat over his head or stuff mud-soaked fabric into his ears. Yet still, the sound found its way in, vibrating through the very soil, rumbling against his chest and rattling the teeth in his skull, reminding him that there was no real silence, no real distance from the war, only noise layered upon noise. And even when one drifted into that light, uneasy state of half-sleep, the concussion of another shell or the sharp crack of rifle fire could yank him back into wakefulness with a pounding heart and a sickening realization that perhaps the next one would not miss. Sleep under such circumstances was fragmented, shallow, and often haunted, because the brain, denied true rest, recycled fear into dreams, and dreams into jolting awakenings, creating a cycle of exhaustion that left men hollow-eyed and shivering as they tried to function through yet another endless day of mud and waiting. And the artillery did not always need to be near to disturb them, for even distant guns carried across the night air, blending with the whine of rats and the drip of water in dugout walls, so that the atmosphere itself felt saturated with war, an inescapable presence that followed them whether they were on duty or off, whether they crouched in the firing line or retreated to the so-called rest areas behind the front, because rest itself had become a cruel joke, an empty word in a world where every man measured his survival not in hours of sleep, but in whether he lived through the next barrage. Officers and commanders encouraged soldiers to snatch rest whenever possible. But those opportunities often came during lulls that were filled with their own unease, because men knew that quiet could be deceptive. The calm before a sudden bombardment, or the eerie silence that heralded an enemy raid. So even as a soldier lay down, his body half willing to collapse into oblivion, his mind kept vigil, ears straining for every shift in the rhythm of guns, his heart racing at the sound of an unusual pause. And this constant edge of dread meant that sleep never refreshed, never soothed, but instead came in fits and fragments, interrupted and shallow, leaving men staggering through their tasks in a fog of weariness that compounded with each passing day. And yet they adapted in small, desperate ways, learning to doze, sitting upright against trench walls, heads tucked onto knees, or collapsing into the straw of dugouts despite the shaking earth around them, because exhaustion eventually overpowered fear, though only briefly, and in those short interludes the mind tried to cling to something normal. Perhaps a remembered bed at home, the quiet creak of familiar timbers, the sound of rain against a roof instead of the detonation of shells. But the line between memory and reality blurred, because often the crack of a shell wove itself into a dream until the dreamer woke gasping, not knowing if he was back home or still trapped in the mud of France. And the soldiers spoke often of how the sound of shellfire remained with them even when it ceased, an echo in the ears, a ghost of noise that carried into the silence. So that sleep deprivation was not simply a matter of too little rest, but of living in a state where rest had been redefined entirely, where survival depended on learning to close one's eyes, even as the world above and around trembled with violence. And for those who failed, for those who could not sleep at all, under the weight of guns, there was collapse, physical and mental, the body simply shutting down, with the mind fracturing into breakdowns that could no longer endure the strain. And though military doctors tried to dismiss such collapses at first, calling them weakness, the truth was undeniable. No human could endure endless nights of terror without consequence. And the constant shellfire made sure that consequence touched nearly everyone. So in the trenches of World War I, sleep was never soft, never safe, but rather a fragile, hunted thing, snatched from the jaws of noise and fear, leaving every soldier to wonder if he had truly slept at all or merely closed his eyes against the sound for a moment before the next explosion reminded him that rest was only ever temporary, and that the war was always, always awake. When the chill of winter settled over the Western Front, the trenches that had already been difficult places to live became even more unbearable. And when we speak of soldiers attempting to sleep in such conditions, the presence of cold and frostbite was not a minor inconvenience, but rather a dominating force that dictated not just their nights, but their every waking and resting moment. For the human body, though resilient in many ways, has limits when subjected to prolonged exposure to damp and freezing temperatures. And the trenches were the perfect environment for misery to thrive in this regard, offering no warmth, little shelter, and conditions that seemed designed to strip away every ounce of comfort, leaving men to wrestle with the impossible task of finding rest while their breath turned to mist and their toes and fingers stiffened until they could scarcely move them. And one must imagine the scene of a trench line in January, with the ground hard as iron, yet slick with frozen mud, the walls glistening with frost that seeped into uniforms, the duckboards covered in ice that made even standing treacherous, and above it all, the cutting wind that blew across the no-man's land, carrying with it a sharpness that sliced through layers of wool and cloth as though there were no barrier at all, forcing soldiers to huddle deeper into their coats, pulling scarves or balaclavas over their faces, pressing their knees against their chests in some futile attempt to conserve warmth. Yet always the cold found its way in, creeping through seams, numbing skin making teeth chatter, and stealing away sleep as surely as any enemy bombardment, because when one is cold beyond bearing, the body shivers and the muscles tense, and true rest becomes impossible, replaced instead with a state of miserable half-consciousness where one drifts only into shallow moments of slumber before waking again with the biting pain of frozen limbs. And within this bleak rhythm, men developed an intimate understanding of what frostbite could do, for it was not merely the sting of icy skin, but the gradual death of flesh itself, beginning in the toes that lost sensation, turning first red, then pale, then dark as circulation failed, and for those unlucky enough to be caught in severe conditions without relief. The damage was permanent, with blackened toes or fingers that would later need to be amputated, and thus sleep, already fragile and scarce in war, became fraught with dread, because even lying still too long in the cold was dangerous. For a man who did not shift or stamped his feet might wake not refreshed, but crippled, and this fear of frostbite was layered upon the ordinary exhaustion of trench duty, making winter nights the most dreaded of all. And soldiers would often write in their letters home of how the freezing air seemed worse than shells or bullets. For while enemy fire could end life suddenly, the cold gnawed slowly, hour by hour, robbing strength, morale, and the possibility of rest. And in those small dugouts where men tried to sleep shoulder to shoulder, the damp was not lessened by the cold, but made more insidious, because blankets, when they had them, froze stiff, boots hardened into shapes that were painful to put back on, and even the simple act of trying to roll over was hindered by layers of clothing and the press of bodies seeking warmth from one another. So that sleeping became more like enduring than resting, and the soldiers, recognizing their shared misery, sometimes sang softly, not with joy, but with the rhythm of men trying to pass the time until dawn, when movement at least gave the illusion of warmth, and in this shared suffering the bonds of comradeship deepened. Yet no bond could erase the bone-deep ache that winter inflicted. And in the morning, when men awoke after such nights, their faces pale and their joints stiff, they dragged themselves from dugouts with boots caked in frozen mud and fingers, too numb to lace or unlace anything, and still the routine of war pressed on, for cold was no excuse for delay, and thus the cycle repeated, night after night, with soldiers learning that the enemy was not only across the barbed wire, but also in the very air they breathed, in the frost that clung to their rifles, in the icy ground that refused to give comfort, and in the long hours of darkness when they longed for the warmth of a fire, a bed, or simply the embrace of sleep without pain. And the psychological toll was immense, because when one cannot sleep well, even the daylight becomes heavier, thoughts slower, and courage harder to muster. And so the winter months became times of quiet suffering, not marked by dramatic offensives, but by the relentless attrition of the elements themselves. And letters, diaries, and recollections reveal that many soldiers remembered these nights more vividly than even some battles, 'cause there is a kind of intimacy in suffering that repeats itself nightly, and the cold was a companion that could not be driven away by bayonet or bullet, but only endured, hour by weary hour. And as we reflect upon it, we understand that sleep in the trenches was not merely challenged by noise, mud, or duty, but in winter by the very season itself, which brought with it a cruelty that nature often reserves for those who are most vulnerable, stripping men of rest, of health, and at times of their very limbs, leaving them with memories of nights when the simple act of closing one's eyes and peace seemed a luxury too distant to imagine. And as dawn broke over these frozen fields, soldiers often looked forward, not with renewed energy, but with the resignation that another night of cold awaited them, an endless cycle until either relief came or the war itself moved them elsewhere. And in this way the cold, relentless, and unforgiving, became as much a character in their story as any general or battle, shaping their lives, their rest, and their very survival in the trenches of the First World War. Sleep in the trenches was never an uncomplicated matter, but if one element more than any other ensured that rest remained elusive, it was the unrelenting thunder of shell fire. For while mud could cling to the body and cold could stiffen the limbs, the roar and violence of artillery invaded the very mind, seizing not only the senses, but also the fragile inner space where sleep might otherwise have taken root. And so, men found themselves caught in a world where the distinction between waking and dreaming collapsed into a haze of constant noise and dread, for the boom of distant guns, the whistle of shells in descent, and the terrible crash of explosions became the soundtrack of their nights, often even more oppressive than in the daytime, because in darkness the imagination worked harder to fill in the unseen, and every shuddering impact could be felt not just in the soil beneath one's body, but in the chest, in the skull, rattling through the bones, leaving soldiers feeling as if their very beings were being shaken apart by the violence of modern war. And though some men reported that after weeks of exposure they could fall into a kind of fitful slumber even amid the cannonade, such rest was never true rest, for the mind continued to race, the nervous system remained alert, and the body woke often with a jolt at the slightest shift in the pattern of sound, as if some part of the soldier had become permanently wired to interpret noise as threat. And, indeed, it was a rational adaptation, for not all shells fell where they seemed destined, and the terrifying phenomenon of a short round meant that even when the barrage was supposedly directed miles away, death might come crashing without warning into a section of trench thought secure. And so the soldier learned to sleep with one ear open, if sleep could even be called by that name, a state of half-awareness, of half-consciousness, where exhaustion dragged the eyelids shut, but the body braced itself against sudden annihilation. And the effect of this fractured pattern of rest was cumulative. For as the weeks stretched into months, men found their tempers fraying, their concentration slipping, and their very sense of reality becoming blurred. With some swearing, they could hear voices in the cannon's thunder, as though the shells themselves whispered their doom, a kind of auditory hallucination born of fatigue and fear. And in this sense, the artillery not only tore apart the landscape, but eroded the inner lives of the men who dwelled within it, reshaping their minds to fit the contours of endless bombardment. And yet, remarkably, human beings are stubborn creatures, and even in this storm of steel, they sought strategies to claim fragments of rest. For some would dig deep into dugouts, reinforced with timber and sandbags, creating chambers below ground, where the earth itself muffled the violence, though even here the vibrations could be felt, as if the earth quaked with each distant gun, and men lying on stretchers or crude bunks could feel their stomachs lurch with every shock wave, while others grew adept at napping in short bursts, slipping into sleep between barrages, grabbing 20 minutes here, an hour there, relying on their comrades to shake them awake when the next duty shift came. And this piecemeal pattern of rest became normal, though it could hardly replace the long, deep sleep the body naturally craves. So the men grew hollow-eyed and weary, their faces etched with lines of strain, their conversations often trailing off mid-sentence as fatigue pulled at their words. And yet, paradoxically, there were also moments when exhaustion was so profound that the body betrayed its own fear, simply shutting down in the middle of a barrage. A man collapsing into slumber while shells screamed overhead, his nerves beyond resistance, and such moments frightened his comrades, who saw in it not resilience, but a kind of surrender, as though the human machine had broken under the weight of too much noise, too much dread, too much sleeplessness. And indeed, the medical officers who observed these men often spoke of shell shock, not only as a result of physical blasts, but as a condition incubated by endless exposure to the sounds and vibrations of war. The nervous system worn raw by the impossibility of silence. For silence was the one thing trench soldiers almost never knew. And if by chance a night passed without bombardment, that very silence could feel uncanny, unsettling. A void in which men whispered to each other, "What are they planning?" As though the absence of shells was simply the prelude to some greater horror. And so rest remained hostage, not only to the thunder of explosions, but to the anticipation of them. The knowledge that sleep was always provisional, always conditional, always poised to be torn apart at any second. And this psychological burden weighed heavily, for the body can survive on poor rations, can endure cold, can even acclimate to mud. But without the renewal of real sleep, the mind begins to unravel. And it was this unraveling that the trenches quietly inflicted on all who lived within them, leaving men not merely tired, but altered, forever attuned to sudden noise, forever awaiting the next shell. And in this way, artillery reshaped not only the landscape of the Western Front, but the inner landscapes of those who tried in vain to sleep among its storms. There's a kind of silence in the trenches that cannot be compared to any quiet we might know in ordinary life, for it is never true stillness, never true peace, but rather a strange and heavy pause that falls between the crashing of shells, a silence so tense that even the men who live within it feel their bodies tighten as though waiting for a blow that has not yet arrived. In this silence, though it might offer a chance for the weary soldier to rest his head, is never restful, never kind, because it is woven with dread, with the knowledge that it will not last, that somewhere far beyond the line of sight, another gun has already been loaded, another shell has already been prepared, and it is only a matter of time before the earth itself is once more ripped apart, shattering what little stillness had been granted. And yet, for men who had endured hours of deafening bombardments, this uneasy silence was sometimes the only gift they had, a fleeting chance to close their eyes and allow the mind to drift, always cautiously, never fully, for even in these moments, the heart still raced and the ears strained, searching the air for any hint that the barrage would resume. To imagine lying there on the hard earth of a trench that smelled of mud, smoke, and unwashed bodies, with your blanket damp and your limbs aching. And to feel the world go suddenly quiet after a day of roaring thunder, it might seem, at first, like a blessing, and perhaps it was. For a man who had been shaken awake again and again by explosions could finally breathe without coughing on dust, could finally let his body sink into the impression carved by his own shape against the floor of the dugout, and could listen to something other than the endless hammering of artillery. But even here, even now, there was no true comfort, for silence in the trenches was never trustable. It was always suspicious, always hiding something, and often the men whispered to one another that it was in the quiet that the enemy made their plans, that it was in the stillness that they crept closer, king their own tunnels beneath no man's land, or preparing to launch the next wave of shells, or even a sudden raid. This fear of silence made sleep itself into an act of courage, for though exhaustion weighed heavily on every soldier's eyes, though bodies craved rest as much as they craved food or warmth, there was always a part of the mind that resisted, closing down, that tugged at awareness like a hand gripping your shoulder, saying, "Do not trust this. Do not let yourself drift too far, because if you do, you may not wake before the next sound shatters the night." In this way, silence was both a relief and a torment, and men learned to exist in its contradictions, sometimes falling into uneasy sleep for 10, 20, perhaps 30 minutes at a time, waking again with a start, eyes darting to the parapet, to the black outline of sandbags above, listening for the sound of boots in the mud, the scrape of a shovel, or the faint whistle of incoming shells. And then lying still once more, waiting for the tension to release or for the first crack of the next bombardment. There were moments when soldiers spoke about the silence as if it had a weight, a physical heaviness that pressed down upon them, making the trench feel tighter, smaller, and colder, as though the air itself had thickened with anticipation. And when that weight finally broke with the first rumble of artillery in the distance, there was sometimes a strange, bitter relief, for at least the waiting was over. At least the silence had been shattered. And now they could once again measure their fear against the sound of shells rather than the dreadful unknown. Yet even in this cycle of noise and silence, fear and relief, men sought ways to cling to small routines, to treat the stillness as a time to mend socks, to light a cigarette, or to scribble a line in a damp notebook. And sometimes these simple actions gave them a rhythm to hold on to, a fragile sense of control, something to remind them that life was more than shells and silence. In the rarest of moments, when the silence stretched long enough, men might even dream, not the full, deep dreams of safe beds, but faint flickers of memory, images of home, the smell of bread baking, the sound of wind in the trees, the warmth of a mother's voice. And though they might vanish as quickly as they appeared, they left behind a kind of ache, a reminder that another world existed beyond the mud, a world where silence meant peace rather than dread. But such moments were fragile, and soon the trench will remind them of where they were, with the drip of water from overhead, the shuffle of rats moving through sacks of rations, the distant cough of a comrade whose lungs had filled with damp, and always, always, the unspoken question, how long until the silence ends? This question haunted every attempt at rest, for no soldier in the trenches could ever lie down without it. And even if their bodies collapsed from exhaustion, even if they surrendered at last to the weight of their fatigue, the silence carried into their dreams, transforming them into restless visions of bombardments that never stopped, of being buried beneath earth, of running through mud that clung like chains. So silence, in truth, was not rest at all, but another form of battle, one fought within the mind, where weariness wrestled with dread, where hope clashed with fear, and where every moment of quiet was both a blessing and a curse. Both the soldiers' only chance for sleep and the reminder that danger was never far away. In the trenches of the First World War, where mud swallowed boots and the ceaseless percussion of artillery framed every soldier's existence, the very act of sleep became a negotiation with exhaustion, fear, and duty, and nowhere was this more evident than in the endless cycle of guards and rotations that cut into the little rest a man might have stolen for himself. Because while the body demanded respite, the war demanded vigilance, and so every soldier, no matter how weary, was bound to the relentless schedule that dictated when he would lie down in the mud and when he would stand watch over the fragile lives of his comrades. For the trenches were not simply ditches dug into the earth. They were defensive fortresses, under constant threat, and every hour of every day someone had to keep watch for sudden assaults, surprise raids, or creeping patrols from the other side. And so the rotation of guards became an unbreakable rhythm of trench life, a rhythm that pulsed even when the men themselves longed only for stillness. And to imagine this life is to imagine being perpetually half awake, knowing that even if you manage to close your eyes and drift toward dreams, the certainty of a rough hand shaking your shoulder in the darkness, or a whispered order calling your name, would drag you back into the cold air before your body had even begun to recover. And so you learn to exist on fractured sleep, never in control of its length, never secure in its quality, always aware that at any moment your rest might be stolen away, as if the war itself refused to allow the mercy of an uninterrupted night. Guard duty was not simply standing at the edge of the trench with a rifle. It was enduring long hours in silence, sometimes in rain that soaked through every layer of clothing, sometimes in snow that burned the skin with its cold, sometimes in fog so thick you could imagine the enemy creeping through it unseen. And all the while, you were expected to fight against the heaviest weight of all the weight of your own eyelids, which sagged with exhaustion after days without proper rest, so that keeping watch became not only a defense against enemy attack, but also a defense against your own body's desperate cry for sleep. And because the army could not risk an inattentive sentry, punishments for falling asleep on guard were severe, at times as harsh as death by firing squad, which meant that men stood trembling in the dark, teeth chattering, fighting back the pull of unconsciousness with every ounce of willpower they had. And yet still, some could not resist, and their comrades remembered the shame and the terror of seeing one of their own dragged away for a mistake that had been nothing more than human weakness. A mistake that might have been any man's on any night. To make matters worse, the timing of rotations rarely respected the body's natural need for long, restorative sleep, instead carving rest into fragments, an hour here, 2 hours there, perhaps 3 if you were lucky, but never the deep, undisturbed sleep the body craves. And so soldiers lived in a constant state of partial wakefulness, their minds dulled by fatigue, their dreams fractured by interruption, until even when they were allowed to rest, they sometimes lay awake, waiting for the inevitable call back to duty, because in such conditions the anticipation of disruption could be as exhausting as the disruption itself. Imagine lying in a dugout, carved into the mud, finally drifting toward the soft embrace of unconsciousness, when suddenly a comrade's voice calls your name, not loudly, but firmly, reminding you that it is your turn to guard. And with stiff limbs, you rise, rubbing your eyes, cursing silently, pulling your greatcoat tighter against the cold, and stepping back into the night where others return from their watch, faces pale and drawn, collapsing immediately into their own shallow sleep, only for the cycle to repeat when your turn is done, so that the entire trench seemed to exist in waves of half-rested men, always moving between wakefulness and exhaustion, but never escaping either one. The soundscape of these nights added another torment, for the very moments when men tried to rest were filled not with silence, but with a drip of water into the mud. The coughs of consumptive comrades, the distant boom of artillery, and the restless shuffling of men on guard. So that sleep was never a surrender, but always a negotiation, a fragile bargain struck against the demands of war. And when you woke or were woken, you never felt as though you had slept at all, only that you had briefly escaped the misery of awareness. Some men tried to adapt, telling themselves that the brief snatches of rest were enough, training their bodies to doze quickly and wake sharply, but others found themselves unraveling under the constant strain, their tempers flaring, their thoughts wandering, their minds clouded by fatigue that no rotation ever seemed to cure. And yet there was no choice, for the cycle was absolute, unchanging, unbreakable, and the trenches demanded its obedience, because vigilance was the thin thread that kept the line from being overrun in the dead of night. Thus, the rotations of guards did not simply disturb sleep. They reshaped it, turned it into something alien, a series of broken fragments strung together by duty, so that when men later remembered their time in the trenches, many recalled not a single full night's rest, but only the endless interruptions, the endless wakings, the endless rhythm of duty, cutting into every attempt at rest, until sleep itself became not a refuge, but another battlefield where men fought against the war's demands. Sleep in the trenches of the First World War was never just a matter of shutting one's eyes and surrendering to slumber. It was an act of survival, an exercise in patience, endurance, and compromise with the body's needs. And as much as soldiers longed for rest, they also learned the subtle art of coping with sleep deprivation, because, in truth, they rarely ever experienced what we might call a full night's sleep. Instead, Their rest came in fragments, broken by duties, gunfire, or the anxiety that gnawed at them. And over time, men adapted in ways that might seem extraordinary to us today, yet were simply the only means of enduring life at the front. For many, the adaptation began with lowering their expectations. No one in the trenches thought of a bed, a pillow, or even the 8 hours of uninterrupted rest we associate with health. Instead, sleep was measured in stolen moments, in a few minutes with one's eyes closed, leaning against a trench wall, or an hour stretched out in the mud with a coat pulled over the head. It was not restful, not restorative in the ideal sense, but it was enough to keep a man going from one watch to the next. The body, remarkable in its resilience, adjusted to these strange rhythms, teaching soldiers to fall asleep almost instantly when given the chance, and to wake equally quickly at the sound of a whistle, a shout, or the pounding of artillery. This skill, if it can be called such, was less a talent and more a survival instinct, for in the trenches, hesitation could mean disaster. And so, a man learned to balance between exhaustion and alertness like a tightrope walker who cannot afford to slip. Alongside this, soldiers created small rituals to trick themselves into rest, even when the environment seemed wholly against it. Some smoked a pipe before lying down, letting the slow rhythm of the act calm their nerves. Others wrote letters home until their eyes grew too heavy to continue. The act of writing, carrying them from wakefulness to sleep with the comforting illusion of normality. And others simply wrapped their greatcoat tightly around their body, making a cocoon against the cold and mud, whispering to themselves or praying until sleep overtook them. These strategies did not erase the exhaustion, but they allowed the men to cope, to soften the sharp edge of sleeplessness and carry on. The camaraderie of the trenches also shaped how men endured their lack of rest. For in those confined, muddy walls, soldiers relied on each other, not just for protection from the enemy, but also for small kindnesses that made the burden bearable. One man might cover a friend's watch for an extra half hour, giving him a rare moment of uninterrupted slumber. Another might share a dry patch of ground, however small, so that both could lie down rather than one remain sitting. And at times, even the simple act of conversation whispered in the dark helped weary soldiers stave off despair, talking until one drifted off, the voice of a comrade becoming the lullaby that soothed the mind. Beyond these human efforts, there was also a kind of grim humor, a wry acceptance that sleep would never come as it should. And so men joked about it, comparing their trenches to hotels, the lice to nightly bedfellows, the booming of shells to an alarm clock. Humor, however dark, allowed them to endure. For laughter was often the only antidote to the relentless fatigue. At the same time, the lack of proper sleep had profound effects. It dulled reflexes, it clouded judgment, it made tempers flare over small things. And sometimes it pushed men into states of near delirium, where they wandered the line between dream and waking, unsure of what was real. Yet, despite this, the machinery of war demanded they press on. And so, coping with sleep deprivation became less a matter of choice and more an unspoken discipline. Each man pushing his body a little further, leaning into the shared struggle and finding small comforts wherever they could. Hot tea, when available, became more than a drink. It was a kind of medicine against exhaustion, the warmth seeping through chilled bodies, reviving a soldier enough to face another watch, another march, another cold dawn. And even when the tea was cold or weak, it was cherished for the ritual it provided. A pause, a break, a moment of something resembling life before the war. Music, too, had its place. Harmonicas, mouth organs, or simply voices raised in song, not loud enough to draw enemy fire, but soft enough to bind men together. The rhythm of singing easing the heaviness of fatigue, and sometimes carrying them through the long, sleepless nights. Yet, Perhaps the greatest coping mechanism was the sheer force of necessity, the knowledge that there was no alternative, no escape, and so the body learned, the mind adapted, and soldiers became experts in microsleep, in finding rest in bursts, in functioning on less, in enduring what seemed unendurable. They carried on, not because they were untouched by exhaustion, but because they accepted it as part of trench life, part of the price of survival. And when moments of true rest did come rare, precious, fleeting, they were treasured beyond measure, a chance to lie down without interruption, to close one's eyes and truly drift, to wake not to gunfire, but to a sliver of silence. However brief, those moments reminded the men that rest was still possible, that they were still human, that even in mud, in noise, in war, sleep was a refuge, however fragile. In this way, the soldiers of the First World War became unwilling masters of coping with sleep deprivation. Their art, not elegant, not scientific, but forged in necessity, in endurance, and in the stubborn will to survive one more day, one more night, one more hour in the trenches. When you think of sleep in the trenches of the First World War, it is tempting to imagine the men being left, least during the long hours of the night, to rest in whatever shallow peace the earth could provide. But the truth was that nighttime was often the most restless and dangerous period. For night did not mean safety, nor did it bring silence. And the very hours that might have been devoted to desperately needed sleep were instead filled with the threat of raids, sudden alarms, and a tense anticipation of enemy movements that seemed to echo through the stillness. And so the soldier, weary and already worn thin from his daily burdens, had to endure another test of endurance as he tried to balance his body's demand for rest with his mind's constant vigilance. For in the trenches, darkness was no ally, and it was often used by commanders on both sides as a veil beneath which small but deadly operations would be carried out, meaning that the soldier's chance of lying still and drifting into slumber was almost always pierced by the fear of what might creep across the wire, or by the certainty that he might be called suddenly to action, to repel, to fire, or to stand watch at a moment's notice. And this reality turned night into something both dreaded and exhausting, because while the body longed to collapse, the heart and mind were never truly free to rest. Night raids were a common part of trench warfare, not always large in scale, but devastating enough to disrupt whatever sense of order a soldier might cling to. But they were designed to unsettle, to kill, to capture prisoners, and to gather intelligence. And even if they did not come every night, the mere possibility was enough to keep the trenches in a state of anxious tension. For each shadow beyond the wire, each rustle in the darkness, each sound of metal scraping or distant whispers of boots on earth could be interpreted as the beginning of such an assault. And thus the soldier's brain was trained to jolt him awake, to flood his body with adrenaline, to keep him in a restless limbo between waking and sleeping that drained him of strength but did not allow for recovery. And so even the act of lying down on the damp, lice-infested ground did not mean the promise of rest, but rather the beginning of a waiting game against the unknown. The commanders often chose the blackest hours before dawn for these raids. Because they understood the weariness of their enemies, they knew that men might be at their lowest point, caught in a fragile half-sleep, and so a raid in those hours could sow the most chaos, forcing the defenders to spring into action with eyes half-closed and hands trembling. And what this meant for those trying to sleep was that the hours they most longed for, those final stretches before morning, were precisely the hours they dreaded most, And this twisted the very rhythm of rest into a kind of torment, because even if one drifted into unconsciousness, he did so with the expectation of being dragged back into violence. Imagine lying in a shallow dugout, mud clinging to your uniform, your blanket still damp from yesterday's rain, your eyelids heavy with exhaustion, and then, somewhere in the stillness, a faint sound, perhaps a wire clinking, perhaps a muffled cough, perhaps only a rat moving among discarded tins, but you could not ignore it. For you knew that it might just as well be an enemy patrol testing the defenses. And so your eyes snap open, your heart races, and all hope of returning to sleep dissolves into the blackness around you. And this cycle repeated itself night after night, teaching men to mistrust the very act of rest. It's teaching them that sleep could be as dangerous as negligence, because to let go fully, to drift into the oblivion of dreams, was to leave yourself exposed in a place where danger did not sleep. And even when the raids did not come, the preparations for them, or the fear of them, still unsettled the men's sleep, for they might be ordered to stand to at dusk and dawn. Standing in the firing step, rifles at the ready, while the dim light played tricks on their eyes and every shadow looked like movement. And once this ritual was done, there was often little time left to lie down, little room in the schedule for proper rest, because the trench was alive at night, alive with patrols, with sentries, with orders being shouted down the line, with the clatter of picks and shovels as men repaired the wire, with the groaning sounds of artillery being prepared in the rear, and with the cries of the wounded carried back under the cover of night. And so night in the trenches was a theater of noise and movement, where sleep was the rarest of luxuries, caught only in fragments, like a candle flickering in the wind, never steady, always in danger of being snuffed out. For the soldier, then, the idea of uninterrupted rest became something distant, almost mythical, a memory of civilian life rather than a reality of trench life. And instead, he learned to steal moments of sleep whenever he could, between duties, between alarms, curled against the earth with his rifle nearby. Never fully surrendered, never fully safe, and this half-sleep was the best he could hope for. And yet, even this was shattered often enough by the sudden crash of flares lighting up the sky, by the rattle of machine guns spitting into the darkness, by the blast of artillery shells meant to soften the line before a raid. And each of these sounds did not just wake him, but jolted him violently, spiking his heart rate, filling him with dread, and leaving him unable to return to the shallow calm he had barely managed to achieve. Over time, this routine carved deep grooves into the soldier's mind and body, grooves of exhaustion that could not be smoothed over by short rests, grooves of fear that became instinctual, for even long after the war, many men reported that they could not sleep in silence, that every small sound would wake them, that the very act of trying to rest brought back the feeling of being trapped in the trenches, waiting for something to come crawling through the wire. And so the nightly raids did more than interrupt sleep. They reshaped it entirely, turning it from a healing act into another battlefield, where the enemy was not just out there in the darkness, but also within the mind, gnawing at the nerves, robbing men of the deep, dream-filled rest that bodies crave. And so, when we consider what it meant to sleep in the trenches, we must remember that sleep was not just about closing the eyes or finding a dry patch of ground. It was about the struggle to surrender, even briefly, in a place where surrender could be fatal. It was about the constant interruptions, the raids, the alarms, the anticipation of violence, all of which transformed the night into something that did not restore the soldier, but drained him further. And in that sense, the nights of the trenches were among the cruelest torments of the war, because they promised the possibility of rest, but delivered instead only fear, tension, and exhaustion without end. Sleep in the trenches was never something that came gently, nor did it ever last without interruption, for even in the darkest, quietest hours of night, when the men might have hoped for a moment of stillness, the earth itself could suddenly begin to tremble as though alive, shaken by the distant thunder of artillery fire rolling across the horizon. A sound that never quite left the ears, a sound that seemed to linger in the chest and in the bones long after the guns had gone quiet, and this constant reminder of war-made drifting into slumber, not only uncertain, but often impossible, for the body might be exhausted beyond measure. Yet the mind could never fully let go of the fear that at any moment the silence would be shattered by the shriek of shells overhead and the crushing impact of explosions nearby, tearing apart both earth and men in equal measure. For soldiers in the front-line trenches, bombardments were an almost daily intrusion, sometimes lasting for only a few minutes, sometimes dragging on for hours, and in the worst cases, stretching into days of unbroken fire, during which no one could close their eyes without the risk of never opening them again, and this meant that rest had to be stolen in tiny fragments. A few minutes here and there when the guns fell silent, a shallow doze rather than a true sleep, the kind of rest that never refreshed but merely postponed collapse. The earth shook violently with every blast, sometimes causing trench walls to cave in, showering men with dirt as they tried to lie down. And even when the shells fell far enough away not to kill or wound, their echoes reverberated endlessly, making the ground itself feel unstable, as though the whole world were breaking apart beneath their boots and beneath their weary heads. To sleep during a bombardment was to attempt the impossible, for the noise was deafening, the flashes of light were blinding, and the fear was constant. So the men often sat awake through the long hours, smoking, staring at the mud, whispering short prayers, or simply waiting with hollow eyes for it to end. And yet, the human body can only endure so much before sleep, however shallow, forces itself upon the senses. And so, there were countless instances of soldiers dozing upright in their dugouts, while the ground rattled and shook, drifting in and out of uneasy dreams that blurred indistinguishably with the chaos outside, until they no longer knew whether the thunder in their ears came from their minds or from the heavy guns that dominated the landscape. The effect of this constant interruption of sleep was cumulative, slowly eroding the men's ability to function, leaving them in a state of perpetual fatigue, a kind of waking exhaustion where orders were followed mechanically, conversations were carried out in dull monotones, and even the will to survive seemed at times to flicker like a candle in the wind, always on the verge of being snuffed out by the relentless roar of artillery. Soldiers described how, after days of bombardment, they became almost numb to the sound. Their nerves stretched so thin that each explosion felt both unbearable and strangely distant, as though they were living in a dream from which they could not wake. And in that dream, sleep itself became a strange and distorted thing, sometimes arriving suddenly in the middle of danger, sometimes refusing to come at all, even when safety and silence returned. The rhythm of life in the trenches was entirely dictated by the guns, and so the men learned to adapt in small, imperfect ways, snatching at rest during the brief pauses between barrages, lying down in their clothes with boots still laced, rifles still close to hand, their bodies half ready for flight, even as their eyes closed. Yet even this was never true rest, for each crack of a rifle, each distant boom, each vibration in the ground was enough to jolt them back awake, and so the cycle repeated, a cruel loop of drowsiness and sudden shock that left them disoriented and more tired with each passing day. To live under bombardment was to live in a state of suspended nerves, where the line between waking and dreaming blurred until one could no longer tell which was which, and in this way, the war invaded even the private space of sleep, ensuring that there was no true escape, no sanctuary, no refuge in the mind or in the body from the constant reminder of destruction. The men came to accept this as normal, though it was anything but, and in letters home they sometimes wrote of it with understatement, speaking of being kept awake by the guns as if this were a small inconvenience rather than a daily assault on both body and spirit. For them, survival depended not only on avoiding the shells, but on finding some way, however fragile, to close their eyes and rest despite them. For without sleep, even the strongest soldier became vulnerable, not just to enemy fire, but to despair. And despair was often as deadly as any bullet. Thus, in the heart of the trenches, where mud and fear and death coexisted without pause, sleep and bombardment wove together into one of the most defining features of life at the front, shaping not only how men lived each day, but how they endured the endless night, always uncertain whether the next moment of slumber would be their last. As the days and nights in the trenches continued, the challenge of finding even brief moments of rest became an intricate balance between body and environment, between the desire for sleep and the constant intrusion of war. For even after surviving a day of exposure to mud, cold, and the endless monotony of trench life, a soldier's exhaustion was never enough to guarantee sleep, and he had to learn, often painfully, to negotiate with his own senses, to listen to the rhythm of the guns and the patrols, to feel the subtle vibrations of the earth that might warn of distant artillery, and to adapt to a world in which comfort was almost entirely absent. Yet somehow, in the midst of these challenges, men discovered ways to steal moments of slumber, curled tightly against the walls of their dugouts, cloned partially hidden in the folds of their heavy coats, and sometimes, when the bombardment paused, or the night offered a fleeting calm, they could lie with eyes closed, drifting into a light sleep, even while their minds remained alert to the slightest change in sound or movement, because the threat of danger never fully dissipated, and even the most exhausted body could be jerked awake by a distant whistle, the scrape of boots on earth, or the sudden cry of a fellow soldier. It's in this fragile balance of sleep and vigilance to find the very essence of life in the trenches. Sleep was fragmented, interrupted, and often shallow, tears, but it was nonetheless fiercely treasured, because even a few minutes of rest could restore enough energy to face another long, muddy day. And in this way, the soldiers developed a unique rhythm, a series of habits and rituals designed to maximize rest while minimizing exposure, lying close to comrades to share warmth, adjusting their positions to avoid pooling water or shifting mud, and learning to-dos while sitting, leaning, or even half-standing when necessary, so that every posture, every moment, was dictated by the dual imperatives of survival and the body's relentless demand for sleep. Over time, the mind adapted to these conditions, learning to accept microsleeps, brief lapses of consciousness that could provide small relief without fully surrendering to the vulnerability of deep sleep. And yet, even these micro-rests were tinged with anxiety, for in the darkness of the trench, every sound, every shadow, and every vibration could signal a threat, and so soldiers often slept with one part of themselves always awake, a kind of half-consciousness that both preserved life and denied full rest. And this strange state, while exhausting, became second nature, as if the body and mind had been rewired to accommodate the harsh rhythms of wartime existence. The physical discomfort of trench life compounded this challenge, for the mud itself, ever present, clung to the men, seeping through clothing, chilling skin, and soaking bedding, so that lying down meant surrendering to dampness and cold, and, even when blankets were available, they were thin and often wet, offering little insulation from the persistent moisture. And yet, soldiers adapted to these conditions as best they could, rolling themselves tightly, pressing their bodies against earth walls, and using whatever small objects or materials they could find to create a semblance of comfort. Even as the mud continued to assert its dominance over the environment, a constant reminder of the relentless reality of trench life. Nighttime routines, when they existed, were brief and functional, focused on necessities rather than comfort, with soldiers cleaning weapons, standing watch, or moving supplies. And even these small interruptions could intrude on rest. Yet, the moments between such tasks were seized with gratitude, as if the very act of lying down, no matter how briefly, were a small victory over the endless demands of war. And these stolen moments of sleep became not just physical recuperation, but also psychological respite, offering a fleeting sense of control and peace in a world otherwise dictated by violence, chaos, and uncertainty. In these moments, the mind often wandered, drifting to memories of home, family, and loved ones. And these imagined comforts provided a kind of mental insulation against the harshness of the trenches, a way to create a small mental space of calm, where the body could rest even while the ears and nerves remained on high alert, listening for the familiar crack of gunfire, the distant rumble of artillery, or the unmistakable sounds of movement near the wire, all of which might indicate danger. Yet even in this constant state of vigilance, the human body pressed for sleep, coaxing man to surrender for even a few minutes to the restorative power of unconsciousness. The duality of alertness and exhaustion created a rhythm unique to trench life, one in which the boundaries between sleep and wakefulness, dreaming and reality, became blurred, and the soldier came to inhabit a world of partial consciousness, where microsleeps and brief rests punctuated the long, tense hours of darkness, providing just enough energy to continue through the day, yet never allowing full restoration. And this rhythm shaped both body and mind, producing a resilience tempered by weariness, a vigilance born of necessity, and a profound appreciation for even the smallest comforts, from a dry patch of ground to a shared blanket or the faint warmth of a companion's presence. The challenges of sleeping under bombardment, with raids, patrols, and rotations, were compounded by the cumulative effects of constant exposure to mud, rain, and cold, and by the psychological burden of witnessing the horrors of war. Yet, the soldier's capacity to adapt, to carve out moments of rest amidst chaos, was remarkable, a testament to human endurance and ingenuity, and a reminder that even in the most unforgiving conditions, the body and mind seek restoration, finding ways to survive that might seem impossible from the perspective of peace and comfort. In this way, sleep in the trenches became a silent struggle, an ongoing negotiation between the demands of the body, the threats of the environment, and the ever-present anxiety of survival. And it was within this struggle that the essence of trench life can truly be understood. For while the mud, the cold, the rain, and the danger defined the external world, the act of sleeping, however fractured, defined the internal experience of the men who endured it, shaping their daily lives, their resilience, and their ability to continue day after day, until relief or the end of service came. And in reflecting on these experiences, we can gain a profound appreciation for the quiet endurance required to navigate the trenches, for the subtle triumphs of brief rest, and for the human capacity to find moments of peace even in the midst of relentless adversity. Sleep, then, was not merely a biological necessity in the trenches. It was also a measure of courage, adaptation, and perseverance, a delicate negotiation with the physical and mental challenges of war, and a subtle, often overlooked battlefield upon which the soldiers fought and survived. And as we consider their experience, we're reminded of the fragility and strength of human life, of the endurance required to persist in extreme conditions, and of the small, stolen victories that made survival possible. And with this reflection, we can gently acknowledge the resilience of those who lived, fought, and slept in the mud, and allow ourselves to appreciate the gift of rest in our own lives, even as we remember the countless men for whom sleep was always fragile, brief, and hard-won. As the war dragged on, and men endured day after day of mud, rain, cold, and fear, sleep became both a sanctuary and a torment, a fragile companion that arrived in fragments and left as quickly as it came. And for those who lived in the trenches of the First World War, the act of lying down, closing one's eyes, surrendering to unconsciousness, was never simple, never guaranteed. And yet, it remained one of the few comforts they could claim. a temporary refuge from the constant demands of vigilance, the endless rotations, and the ever-present threat of artillery, raids, or sudden violence. And so the soldiers learned, slowly and painfully, to negotiate with their own bodies, to coax rest wherever they could, to fold themselves into the mud. Their greatcoats pulled tightly, their rifles close at hand, their ears straining even in exhaustion for the faintest warning of danger. For in those moments of almost sleep, they could not fully trust that they would awaken unscathed. And this uncertainty shaped the very nature of rest, turning it into a delicate exercise in endurance, patience, and quiet resilience, because even in the midst of war, the human body demanded respite, and men found ways, however imperfect, to give it. Some lay beside comrades, using each other's presence as a thin shield against the terror of isolation. Others leaned against walls of earth or sandbags, seeking stability in a world that was constantly shaking, their minds drifting between memories of home and the soft pool of dreams that might only last minutes before the next alarm. The next patrol, the next bombardment, reminded them that they were still very much alive and still very much exposed. And in this suspended state, sleep became both necessary and almost impossible. Paradox that defined life in the trenches, because the very act of survival demanded vigilance even when the body most wanted to rest. Over time, men developed habits to manage this strange rhythm, whispering to one another in the darkness, smoking, or reciting letters from loved ones in their minds. Small rituals that gave structure to the night and offered a sense of control. In a place where control was nearly impossible, and sometimes the simplest acts, like closing one eye at a time to doze, or tilting the head just so to escape the cold, became survival strategies, because even the smallest advantage in comfort could mean the difference between enduring another day or succumbing to exhaustion. Yet sleep in the trenches was not only shaped by environment and routine, it was also deeply shaped by the mind, by the constant presence of fear, grief, and uncertainty. For soldiers carried with them memories of friends lost, of battles endured, and of the thin, often invisible line separating life from death. And these thoughts intruded upon rest in ways that no mud, no greatcoat, and no careful positioning could prevent. For even when the body lay still, the mind remained alert, scanning for threats, replaying events, imagining the worst, and sometimes weaving dreams that were not dreams at all, but echoes of the horrors witnessed, all of which made the brief hours of slumber a kind of liminal space, neither fully restful nor fully conscious. A place where the body was attended to, but the mind was still very much awake. And yet, despite the constant interruptions, the physical discomfort, the chilling cold, and the mental strain, the act of attempting to sleep held profound significance. For it was a reclamation of humanity, a quiet assertion that even in the midst of war, even in mud and blood, the body and mind still required moments of calm, moments in which the world could be temporarily ignored, moments in which the soldier could become simply a human being again, rather than a participant in an endless battle. And so these stolen moments of rest, however fleeting, were treasured, cultivated, and fiercely protected whenever possible, because they offered a glimpse of normalcy, of peace, of continuity with a life that existed outside the trenches. In many ways, the trenches themselves seemed to dictate the form of sleep, bending it to the rhythms of combat, fear, and duty, so that no night was ever the same. And yet, all nights shared common features: the ever-present mud that clung to skin and clothing, the chill that seeped into bones, the ceaseless background noise of distant shells, the shuffling and whispering of fellow soldiers, and the intermittent calls that reminded every man that he remained part of a larger system, a small piece of a vast, grinding war machine. And it was in these small shared details that soldiers found both frustration and solace, For while the environment made true rest impossible, the company of others made endurance bearable, and so sleep, even in its most fragmented form, became a communal, if unspoken, act of survival. As days became weeks, and weeks became months, men grew accustomed to this fractured rhythm, to the alternation of wakefulness and microsleep, to the strange skill of dozing while still remaining alert, to the constant negotiation with fear, cold, and discomfort. And in this way, they became, against all odds, masters of endurance, adapting their minds and bodies to circumstances that would have seemed unimaginable in peacetime. And yet, their mastery was fragile, temporary, and never absolute, for sleep remained always tentative, never fully secure, and always susceptible to the whims of artillery, patrols, rotations, and the harsh environment. And when the war finally ended for those who survived, when they left the trenches behind and returned to a world that was quieter, safer, and warmer, the habits formed in mud and fear persisted, for the memory of nights spent half asleep under constant threat lingered, shaping their understanding of rest and fatigue, and reminding them that sleep is never just a physical act, but also a negotiation with circumstance, a dialogue between body and environment. And, in this sense, the trenches left an indelible mark on the very physiology and psychology of men, a mark that endured long after the guns had fallen silent. And so, as we reflect on how people slept in the trenches of World War I, we must recognize both the incredible resilience of the human body and spirit, and the staggering cost of living in a place where even sleep became a battlefield. And, in remembering their experience, we honor the quiet endurance, the small victories over fatigue, fear, and mud, the subtle triumph of finding moments of rest in a world designed to deny it. And in doing so, we glimpse not only the horrors of war, but also the remarkable capacity of humans to survive, to adapt, and to reclaim fragments of peace in even the most unforgiving circumstances. And with this reflection, we can gently allow ourselves to drift into our own rest, to close our eyes with gratitude for the comfort of safety, for the luxury of uninterrupted slumber, and with the soft thought, for those who could not, let us whisper good night.